Portal 1 is renowned for being near perfect in its design, and that includes its tutorial, which, as I said in my last video on Portal, is essentially the entire game. However, with Portal 2 being, up until very recently, the highest rated game on Steam, as well as also being renowned for its quality, and most importantly, the successor to one of the most beloved games of all time, how does Portal 2 improve on perfection? In this video, I'm going to break down the same number of areas as I did for Portal 1, comparing each section to see what each game did differently, when they introduced mechanics, how many times they used different mechanics, and how they dealt with teaching new and old players the tried and trusted mechanics of the first game. Firstly, let's bunch the first few areas together, as something which is crystal clear from the design of these first few areas is that Valve assumed that no one played the first Portal game. Now, there is a slight offset to the parity of the opening sections of both games, as Portal 1 starts the player off straight away with an introduction to portals as well as a tutorial on camera controls and movement, whilst Portal 2 has a more cinematic set piece where the player is introduced to camera controls and movement, and Wheatley of course, but no portals. Once the player lands in the original starting area of the first game, but this time in Portal 2, the player waits 60 seconds and proceeds to the next room via two portals which have opened for them, and then they place a cube on a button teaching them about picking up objects and the cause and effect of placing weighted cubes on buttons, which is that they open doors. Next we move on to the first difference in the starting areas. Both areas teach the player that portals can be placed on different surfaces, and entering and exiting them at different points in space results in different outcomes. They also teach the player that you can take cubes through portals. However, in Portal 2, they bring way forward the button mechanic, which the player doesn't even come across until much later in Portal 1, and allows the player to change the location of portals at the press of a button. Not only does this concisely teach a pretty basic mechanic earlier, so it can be used earlier, but it's also a nice quality of life change too. Next we move on to a very different looking but functionally the same area, which is where the player gets the portal gun and are taught to create an entrance with the portal. Same with the next area. Players are taught how to create entrances but also create exits, which is the same in both games at this point. The next area is also completely the same between games, with the player learning they can move cubes through portals without touching them. And then we come into the final area, which is exactly the same between games. The player must combine everything they've learned so far to complete this puzzle, creating entrances and exits with portals, moving cubes through portals with and without touching them, and with the added complication of there being two pressure plates and two cubes. So now we move on to the big divergence between the games. In Portal 1 there is a mechanic which is an energy ball, which acts as both as a key and a danger to the player. The player must move the energy ball through portals as it flies through the air. However, in Portal 2, they bring forward the lessons about momentum a few areas earlier. Whilst in Portal 1, the player is learning about energy balls, where in one room you place a portal for the energy ball to fly through, then in the next room you do the same, but you must land on a lift through a portal, and then in the final room you must change the portal's locations to change the energy ball's path. In Portal 2, the player must master momentum in order to progress. The first momentum area teaches the player that momentum affects items. If they send an item through a portal, it can come flying out the other end to a location they need it to be. Also, thanks to the earlier introduction of the button, they have to use the timed button to bring up panels, another new mechanic in the game. In the second area, the player must do this again, but with themselves this time, but without having to worry about buttons and panels. We are now back at a parallel as we look at the next few areas. We are looking at the same areas in terms of where they are placed sequentially in the game. Starting at area 11 in Portal 1, the player is introduced to the emancipation grid for the first time in a meaningful way, meaning that it's an actual obstacle for completing the puzzle. The player must portal past the emancipation grid so the cube does not get dissolved on its way to the pressure plate. In Portal 2, the player has just gotten the dual portal device, meaning they can shoot both blue and orange portals. In Portal 2, the area continues on, forcing the player to place multiple blue and orange portals in sequence to traverse through the area. Now, this is a very important lesson, specifically for Portal 2, as once you get into old Aperture, just traversing around the facility takes up so much playtime. So getting the player used to this style of gameplay early on is important to do. In area 12 in Portal 1, the player is finally taught about momentum, though without the use of items. The player must simply fling themselves 3 times in order to progress. But in area 12 in Portal 2, the player is introduced to this game's version of the energy ball, the laser. Now this is very obviously a straight swap in terms of mechanics, as the room where the player learns about lasers is the exact same as the first game. It's just lasers instead of an energy ball. Now in the final area we're going to cover, Area 13, in Portal 1 the player must combine all lessons about portals, entrances and exits, energy balls, lifts, and tackle the introduction of a timed button in order to get to the dual portal device, which is done 2 areas earlier in Portal 2, despite Portal starting off much quicker than Portal 2. In the final area of Portal 2 that we're going to cover, again Area 13, the player is introduced to the redirection cube, which can change the direction of lasers. This puzzle also reaffirms the fact that the player can and will need to move cubes without touching them, as they need the laser to be active until they get to the pressure plate, and then they need to get the cube which has made the laser active in order to get it onto the pressure plate. Now it might feel that we are leaving off Portal 2 mid-flow, but it's the fact that despite the game having more mechanics in it and starting off slower, the game puts a lot more into each chamber when it deviates from the original. So by Area 10 in Portal 2, we have already passed the opening tutorial, and this is because the game prioritizes core mechanics over external mechanics with regards to its pacing. In Portal 1, in areas 8, 9 and 10, the player is learning about energy balls without much else being taught. In Portal 2, what is essentially the same mechanic, the lasers, isn't taught until after what is deemed as the opening tutorial, before the dual portal device. Instead, the game teaches the player in these moments about momentum, but it introduces extra lessons within these moments, like items being affected by momentum, and introducing a brand new mechanic like the panels. Additionally, the game time of both tutorials is actually roughly the same, but Portal 2 adds about 5 minutes of almost pure storytelling into the mix, further illustrating how Valve have tightened up the tutorial for the sequel. Now, overall, there isn't much difference between the 2 tutorials. It isn't like the player is getting a crazy different experience, but this is what they are getting. The player is getting more to learn in a shorter amount of time, with more focus on the core mechanics, leaving the most external mechanics until after the player has the dual portal device, which for me is a great example of how a sequel can improve on its predecessor with regards to onboarding. Don't reinvent, just restructure and cut out the fat. Thanks for watching, don't forget to subscribe and tune in next week for another entry into the game design library. And keep on keeping on.